love the Lord because He has heard my voice and my supplication, because He inclined His ear to me. Therefore I will call on Him as long as I live. The snares of death encompassed me. The pangs of soul laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish.
Then I cried to the Lord. O Lord, I pray, save my life. Gracious is the Lord, and righteous our God is merciful. The Lord protects the sinner. When I was troubled, He saved me.
Return,
O my Lord, to your rest. For the Lord has acted contentedly with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from fear, my feet from stumbling.
I walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I have kept my faith, even when I said, I'm greatly afflicted. I said in my consternation, everyone is a liar.
What shall I do unto the Lord, for all His bounty to me? I will lift up the house of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all His people.
Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His faithful ones. O Lord, I'm your servant, the child of your serving God. You have loosed my bounds.
I offer to you a thanksgiving sacrifice and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all His people, in the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst of Jerusalem. Praise the Lord.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Chris. So we're continuing our sort of mini series on the Psalms. It would be great to preach through all the Psalms, but it would take so long. So this is Psalm 116. It's this great song of thanksgiving. I guess I gotta get my... And as with the majority of the Psalms, we don't know when, where, or by whom this poem was written. The poem begins with the psalmist's joyful declaration of love for God because God has heard. The verb to hear in Hebrew is in the imperfect tense, and thus I think verse 1 can be better translated, I love the Lord because God hears my voice. God is constantly listening, paying attention, and is aware of the psalmist's voice. The language of the opening verse of the psalm is Exodus language. God says to Moses in Exodus 3, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians. In the Exodus story, the people cry out without knowing to whom they cry. They cry out to anyone who is listening, who might be listening, and God hears. God delivers. This unexpected and miraculous intervention of God on the psalmist's behalf provides the affirmation that God is steadfast and trustworthy. God's powerful deliverance has confirmed for the psalmist that God isn't distant, isn't aloof, isn't uninterested, isn't far off in some place up in the sky, but God is present in our midst, with us, hearing us, listening to us. God is close, committed, and caring. And so the psalmist will call on God as long as he lives. The deep crisis that led to the poet's cry for help is unspecified. The subtitle of the psalm describes the poem as thanksgiving for recovery from an illness, and this is certainly possible, but we ought to be cautious. Like the chapter and verse distinctions in our Bibles, subtitles aren't original to the text. They were added later. And so we should always be careful not to rely too heavy on the subtitles for our interpretation of the text. Of course, illness is a reason to cry out. But in our lives, we experience a host of calamities that disorient us and unsettle us. About a week ago, I had a young woman come to my office in despair because she had just failed her midterm exam. Now, you might think, midterm exam, come on, we have COVID-19, we have wars, we have cancer, we have all these terrible things. Midterm exam, like, that's nothing. But it wasn't nothing for her. For her, it was a deep crisis. Her whole future was at stake. The unspecific nature of the crisis in the psalm allows it to speak universally. For this young woman, who wasn't even a believer as far as I know, failing her exam spun her world out of control. This collapse was real, and her only recourse was to seek out someone whom she believed might have some answer or access to a power or a reality that transcended her dislocation. I had to disappoint her. I have no access to any power. The very nature of disorientation resists generalization. Whether it's a debilitating disease or failing an exam, the death of a child or being dumped by a boyfriend or a girlfriend, the psalm speaks into all of them. And the word it speaks to describe this disorientation is death. Death is the only word that can capture the reality of the crisis. The snares of death encompassed me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. The imagery suggests entrapment, smothering, a struggling against powers that are too strong to resist. The crisis feels like you're being pulled down by a malevolent grip from which you're unable to escape. You feel helplessly trapped in the darkness of the abyss. You are unexpectedly engaged with a chaos that can't simply be attributed to human sin, but is in fact a primordial darkness that threatens to undo creation itself. You experience the end of life, the end of light, the end of hope. All that remains is anguish and distress. I know this. Yesterday was my dad's birthday. He would have been 79. And boy, all those feelings come back. I remember that darkness. Oh, how can I forget? It's still in me. It's still with me. It's in the midst of this darkness and despair that the psalmist dares to speak. She calls upon the name of the Lord, and in doing so, brings the crisis into the presence of God. Or perhaps more appropriately, the presence of God comes to the psalmist in her darkness. And with God's arrival, the disorientation reaches its limits. Just as at the creation, God separated the land from the waters of chaos, so by bringing the crisis before God, God declares to the darkness, "This far you will go, but no farther." The psalmist speaks. God arrives, and death no longer has the final word. In faith, the psalmist cries out, and God hears, and God rescues. Gracious is the Lord and righteous, the psalmist can now declare. Our God is merciful. Anyone who insists that grace is limited to the New Testament clearly has not read Psalm 116. The psalmist acknowledges that it's God who has done it, and that it's all because of grace. That is, God's arrival is unexpected, beyond hope, unlooked for, and in the nick of time. There's no description of how the deliverance occurred. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann writes, "The newness can't be explained. It can't be predicted, and it can't be programmed. We don't know how such newness happens, any more than we know how a leper is cleansed, or how a blind person can see, or how a dead person is raised to new life. We don't know how, nor do the speakers of these Psalms. Since Israel can't explain and refuses to speculate, Israel does what it does best. It tells, it recites, it narrates, it testifies in amazement and gratitude. This newness can't be explained because it's not some kind of mechanical transaction. It's a relational transformation. But the reality of the transformation can't be denied. The Lord protects the simple. When I was brought low, God saved me. Return, O soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. The distress, the anguish and fear that the psalmist experienced during the crisis is now only a memory. And the psalmist can now enter a state of calmness and tranquility. In essence, there's now a time for Sabbath. That is, a renewed dependence on God. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. The tender embrace of God has replaced the smothering hand of death. And so the psalmist can walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Death has been overcome by the grace and mercy of God. The deliverance occurred because the psalmist dared to speak and God was listening. This, I think, is the point of verse 10. I kept my faith, or I trusted in God, the psalmist declares, even when I said, I am greatly afflicted. This is no pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, no self-congratulatory affirmation of the strength of one's faith, no pious stoicism as if the crisis was no match for my faith. Rather, the crisis was so threatening, the cords of death so entangling, the darkness so deep, that the psalmist has nothing else to do but to speak, no other option but to cry out. I can't help but think of that story in Acts 16. You remember the one? Paul and Silas are in the city of Philippi where they meet this slave girl possessed by the spirit of divination. Her handlers have been making a profit on her ability. So she follows Paul and Silas around declaring that they were slaves of the Most High God. Finally, fed up by her constant yelling, Paul turns and orders the spirit out. When her owners realize that their moneymaker is useless, they seize Paul and Silas, bring them before the magistrates, who have them thrown into prison. In the middle of the night, Paul and Silas begin praying and singing hymns to God. The text doesn't tell us which songs they were singing, but it wouldn't be so great a stretch to imagine them singing the Psalms. And we like to assume that they'd be singing happy praise songs, the kind that we love to sing. But considering the situation they're in, it seems more likely they would have been singing the songs of lament. But whatever they were singing, the point is that they are in the deepest, darkest part of the prison, and their feet are in stocks. There's literally nothing else they can do except sing. They don't sing because they expect that God is going to rescue them. They don't know what's going to happen. For all they know, they may die the next day. But they sing. The desperate utterance of Paul and Silas, end of Psalm 116, is the act of faith, not an act of strength, but an act of weakness, a whisper or a whimper. Such faith bears fruit not because of the speaking in and of itself, but because the psalmist speaks and God hears. For this reason, I think the NIV actually has a better translation of the verse. I believe, therefore I said, I am greatly afflicted. The point isn't to emphasize that the psalmist kept faith in the midst of the crisis, and therefore we too should keep faith in the midst of the crisis. That's not the lesson. Rather, the point is that in the midst of the crisis, the psalmist in faith speaks. Prayer is important. Prayer matters. But prayer isn't the property of the pious. Prayer isn't a tool that we have, a kind of technology that we can use to get what we need or what we want. This turns prayer into a kind of means to an end. The word prayer comes from the Latin word, meaning precarious, as in, this is the prayer of people who are hanging by their fingertips, who have nothing left. Praying to anyone who will listen. Praying because there's nothing left to do but to pray. Too often our prayers come out of a place of security and certainty. But in the face of death, there is no certainty. There's no security. There's just hanging on by a thread. And that's when prayer matters. The proper response to God's deliverance is thanksgiving. And the remaining verses of the psalm are about this. Gratitude is more than an inner experience or feeling. It's a public response that is practiced before others. The words of thanksgiving are spoken in the assembly of the redeemed. What shall I return to God for all his bounty to me? The psalmist asks. On the surface, this sounds like there's been some kind of economic transaction. God did something for me, so now I'm going to do something for God. Such an attitude only betrays how deeply embedded we are in worldly thinking. All these things that the psalmist does at the end of the psalm, it's crucial to remember that God never asks for them. God never demands that the psalmist pay vows or offer gratitude in the psalm. As much as I love the beautiful hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, which we sang, I can't help but poke a little bit at that last stanza. Love so amazing, love so divine, demands my heart, my soul. Love doesn't demand. Love is unconditional. It doesn't demand, it doesn't command. It invites, it calls. The response of the psalmist is a response to love, not because the psalmist has been told by God, because I did this for you, now you have to love me and worship me and do all this stuff for me. That's not the God that I know. God doesn't demand worship, doesn't demand gratitude, doesn't demand that the psalmist pay God back for what God has done. The deliverance is completely and utterly unconditional. Everything the psalmist does is a response to God's love, but not something the psalmist owes. What the psalmist is confessing is that transformation has occurred in the light of God's deliverance. The vows that follow are an effort to say, in response to your saving love in my life, O God, I confess that I will never again be the same person I was before. This, I think, is the essence of thanksgiving. To be thankful is to acknowledge that some other has interrupted my life with grace and love. To be grateful is to be responsive. Grateful people know that they're not alone in the world. They're not self-sufficient, self-autonomous, self-reliant people. Thanksgiving is Israel and our exercise in truth-telling about ourselves. In this truth-telling, we give our lives over in gratitude to God and attest publicly in the world that God is reliable and adequate for every circumstance in life. This is why the psalmist declares 3 times in the psalm that he will call upon the name of the Lord. Thanksgiving is a confessional statement. The act of thanksgiving is the act of relying upon and committing oneself to another. The psalmist's public profession of faith and the vows he makes to the Lord in the presence of the people, as well as the sacrifices of thanksgiving in the temple, all display the transformed life of the psalmist and testify to the faithfulness and steadfast love of God. Such testimony is important. For thanksgiving to be real, it must move from response to responsibility. We have to remember that for God, true sacrifice has more to do with acts of justice and loving kindness than it does with burnt offerings. So any vows we make that are unaccompanied by a love for our neighbor are empty and irrelevant. Real thanksgiving understands that the grace and mercy God so abundantly delivers in our time of crisis is the same grace and mercy that is available to all people everywhere, unless we don't say anything about it or do anything about it. The goal of gratitude for the psalmist and for us is that all people everywhere would call on the name of the Lord. And this brings us finally, and I think properly, to the Apostle Paul. I need a Bible. I'll just take, that's okay, Ari, I'll just take one from the back. I knew I forgot something. I don't have it memorized, I'm sorry. Psalm 116 is echoed and alluded to by a number of New Testament authors, but I think it finds its strongest expression in Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth. In the opening verses of chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, Paul is at great pains to emphasize that the focus shouldn't be on him, but should be on the crucified and resurrected Jesus, the one who Paul has come to know as the Messiah. His job, Paul's job, his call, is to make Jesus known and then to get out of the way, to make sure he isn't blocking the light. For that is what Jesus is to Paul in 2 Corinthians 4. Paul writes, "For it is God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' who has shone into our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." For Paul, Jesus is the one through whom the promises of God for Israel and for the world are finally being fulfilled. Jesus is the light that shines in the darkness. Jesus is God's response to death and to the crises of our lives. Jesus is God's Son, God's image, God's life, God's love. And then Paul moves on into the section of chapter 4 where Psalm 116 is evoked, and I'm just going to read 2 Corinthians 4, 7 to 15, where Paul writes, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. It is written, 'I believed, therefore I have spoken.' With that same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak, because we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you in his presence. All this for your benefit, so that the grace that is reaching more and more people may cause thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God." This is Psalm 16. Paul is doing a riff. He quotes only the very short phrase from verse 10, "I believed and so I spoke." But Paul expects his audience and us to hear all of Psalm 116 in the background. He brings in the quotation after listing his sufferings, just as the psalmist did before she uttered the expression quoted by Paul. Paul shares the sufferings with the psalmist and also her faith, which enables Paul to speak, to bear witness to Christ. As with the psalmist, the traps of death were all around Paul. The scent of Sheol was in his nostrils. He was being constantly dragged down and ensnared. But there, down in the depths, God, Israel's God, came to his rescue. Because Paul was so shaped by Israel's story, because as a boy he sang Israel's songs, Psalm 116 fits Paul like a glove. Paul cried out, God heard, God rescued. What is new is that Paul had come to believe that Israel's God was also the father of Messiah Jesus, the one who, like Paul, like the psalmist and Israel, had also gone down into death, but was raised to new life by the power of God. And so immediately after he quotes Psalm 116, Paul proclaims the resurrection of Jesus and our resurrection. For Paul, the death and resurrection of Jesus is God's redemptive response to Israel and the world's desperate cry for deliverance. In the death and resurrection of Jesus, death itself, the final enemy, all of that which seeks to ensnare and entangle and smother, has been finally and ultimately defeated. And like the psalmist, Paul's goal is that more and more people might experience this resurrection of God and respond with thanksgiving. So thanksgiving will increase. As New Testament scholar N.T. Wright says, the more people are praising God, the more the world is taking the shape it was meant to have. And the more God's power goes out to save and heal where those generous blessings are still needed. Psalm 116 is a beautiful, poetic expression of the gospel in that it expresses the three great claims of biblical faith. We are caught in the snares of death. We have been rescued by the power of God. We are released to a new life of gratitude. In this psalm, we can hear the voice of Jesus, who on Good Friday knew all about the snares of death, who walked out into new life on Easter morning, and who gives thanks to God who shapes his life and the life of his people in our celebration of communion and baptism and in our fellowship together. We learn from this ancient Hebrew poem that the movement from death to deliverance to doxology is a way of being in the world that is characterized by new life and new energy and a new noticing about the need in the world and the resources for healing. We see now that old enemies are really needy neighbors. We see that what looked like scarcity is actually enough when shared, enough to feed a crowd when there is gratitude. And we find that we are less greedy, less anxious, less coercive, less self-preoccupied, because we're able to rest our lives and our bodies down in the bottomless goodness of God. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, as usual, are there any announcements that we need to hear? I know there's, again, always remember our family in your prayers throughout the week, all of us. But I think, okay, well, let's stand together for the Lord's blessing.